The early morning sky over the Kazakh-Russian border was filled with the sound of engines idling and the frustrated shouts of drivers. Thousands of trucks lined up in both directions, stretching as far as the eye could see. What had once been one of the most reliable trade corridors in Eurasia, the Kazakhstan Land Bridge, had suddenly gone silent. Overnight, new customs restrictions appeared, and the border was effectively sealed. No one could explain why. Russian drivers stood beside their trucks in disbelief, watching their cargo spoil under the rising sun. For many of them, this route was their lifeline, carrying food, electronics, industrial parts, and fuel between Russia and Central Asia. Now, everything was frozen in place. At first, Russian media tried to downplay the event, calling it a temporary technical issue, but satellite images began to circulate online, showing massive queues of trucks stranded for miles. Social media videos told the real story: frustrated truckers running out of fuel, food, and patience. A few tried to cross through smaller checkpoints, but even those were blocked. By the second day, panic was spreading among logistics companies in Moscow. The Kazakhstan route had been crucial for connecting Russia to markets in China and beyond. Losing it meant losing one of the last reliable arteries in a region already strained by sanctions and economic pressure. Moscow's officials made statements promising a quick resolution, but whispers from inside the Ministry of Transport painted a darker picture. The shutdown wasn't an accident. It was a signal. Kazakhstan's government had recently been showing signs of independence, quietly deepening its economic ties with China and Turkey. Some experts believed Astana was testing Moscow's limits, asserting its sovereignty after years of uneasy partnership. Russian state television avoided the subject, focusing instead on domestic unity and self-reliance. But ordinary Russians could sense something bigger unfolding. The phrase "land bridge collapse" began trending on social media, carrying an uneasy echo of the empire's fragility. By the end of the first week, the crisis was no longer confined to the border. Moscow's supermarkets began to feel the impact. Empty shelves started to appear in major cities. Sugar and rice disappeared first, followed by imported electronics, car parts, and industrial materials. Videos posted online showed long lines of shoppers searching for basic goods. The government tried to calm the situation by saying that domestic production would fill the gaps. But few believed it. Truck drivers stranded at the border were now sleeping in their vehicles, surviving on shared food and small fires made from broken pallets. Local Kazakh villages tried to help, bringing bread and tea, but there were too many people and too few supplies. International observers began paying attention. In Washington, economists warned that this could be more than a regional issue. If Russia's supply routes through Kazakhstan remained blocked, it could create ripple effects across global commodity markets. Wheat, oil, and metal exports might slow down, affecting prices worldwide. Meanwhile, in Europe, analysts pointed out that Kazakhstan's move, whether deliberate or not, revealed a deeper geopolitical shift. The once tightly controlled post-Soviet space was fragmenting. Inside Kazakhstan, officials insisted that the closure was caused by technical maintenance and safety upgrades, but few outside the region believed that explanation. The timing was too precise, coming just as Moscow struggled with trade restrictions and international isolation. In the US, think tanks began publishing reports describing it as the soft revolt of Central Asia, where countries were quietly rebalancing away from Russian influence and toward new economic partners. Back in Moscow, the sense of unease grew. The government launched a campaign urging citizens to remain calm, but the images of stranded trucks and empty store shelves told a different story. Economists warned that logistics costs were tripling as companies tried to reroute through China or Iran. For many, it was not feasible. The land bridge had been the most cost-effective artery connecting Russia to the world beyond sanctions. Without it, the supply network was collapsing like a row of dominoes. The crisis revealed the vulnerability of a nation that had long believed itself untouchable in its neighborhood. The blockade was not a war, not an invasion, and not a sanction. It was something more subtle and possibly more damaging. It was the quiet withdrawal of cooperation, a reminder that even allies could choose to walk away. As night fell over the frozen trucks at the border, their headlights formed a glowing river. Across the steppe, a symbol of a stalled empire, watching its lifelines vanish in the dark. In Astana, the capital of Kazakhstan, a sense of quiet intensity filled the air. Inside government offices, closed-door meetings stretched late into the night. The leadership faced a difficult choice: to maintain the fragile balance with Moscow or to use this moment to redefine Kazakhstan's independence. The land bridge shutdown had triggered international headlines, but officials avoided public comment. Behind the scenes, they debated the consequences of reopening or keeping the border tight. Some advisors warned that angering Russia could invite political or economic retaliation, but others argued that Kazakhstan was already living in Moscow's shadow for too long. The shutdown, they said, was a test, a show of control over its own territory and its own trade. Kazakhstan's diplomats reached out cautiously to Beijing and Ankara, exploring new transport routes and supply deals. China was quick to respond, offering to expand rail connections through the Belt and Road Initiative. Turkey offered logistical support through its growing Central Asian network. For the first time in years, Astana felt it had options beyond the Kremlin's orbit. But Moscow's patience was wearing thin. Russian media began hinting that foreign influence was behind the crisis. Commentators accused the West of manipulating Kazakhstan to weaken Russia's regional dominance. Yet within Kazakhstan, many saw the blockade as a necessary step toward sovereignty, a way of saying that their nation would no longer act as Moscow's satellite. Internationally, the story gained traction. Western analysts described the move as a quiet rebellion, comparing it to the early cracks in the Soviet Union's structure decades earlier. The US media called it a new kind of Cold War, fought not with tanks or missiles, but with trade routes, border policies, and logistics choke points. In Astana's parliament, younger lawmakers openly discussed diversifying alliances. Their message was simple: the world had changed, and Kazakhstan must change with it. But they spoke cautiously, aware that Moscow still held significant economic power. Russian investors owned key infrastructure in Kazakhstan, and energy ties ran deep. Any confrontation risked severe backlash. While the debate unfolded in Astana, Moscow's response was becoming more aggressive. Russian state TV ran long segments blaming Kazakhstan for economic sabotage. Commentators accused the country of betraying its Eurasian Economic Union partners and acting under Western pressure. The Kremlin's official statement called for constructive dialogue, but behind those words lay frustration and anger. Russia needed that land bridge, not just for trade, but as a symbol of its regional dominance. Losing control of it would expose weakness to both friends and foes. Diplomatic teams were dispatched to Astana under the radar. Meetings between Russian and Kazakh officials were tense. Moscow demanded an immediate reopening of the border, but Astana insisted that the shutdown was purely technical. Russian negotiators returned home empty-handed. Back in Moscow, the government launched an extensive media campaign, declaring that supply routes are being restored. But on the ground, truck drivers and warehouse managers saw little improvement. Shelves in southern Russian cities were still bare. Small stores began rationing basic goods, while prices surged for fuel and imported items. Independent journalists managed to film the situation along the border despite tight security. Their footage showed hundreds of trucks still parked, engines silent, drivers exhausted and hopeless. Local police tried to block reporters, but videos spread online within hours. The images contradicted everything Moscow was telling its citizens. It was clear the crisis was far from over. Meanwhile, economists warned that the Eurasian Economic Union, once a symbol of post-Soviet cooperation, was starting to fracture. Member states, seeing Russia's struggles, were quietly reassessing their commitments. As the weeks dragged on, frustration in Russia grew into quiet anger. Businesses complained that the government's promises were empty. Farmers couldn't get fertilizers. Manufacturers ran out of imported components, and consumers were paying double for what little remained on shelves. Still, the Kremlin refused to publicly confront Kazakhstan. Officials knew that pushing too hard might drive Astana further toward Beijing or Washington. Instead, they doubled down on propaganda, presenting the crisis as a temporary inconvenience caused by foreign meddling. Behind the scenes, Russian diplomats continued to negotiate, offering trade incentives and new energy deals in exchange for reopening the land bridge. But Astana held its ground. The message from Kazakhstan was polite but firm. Times had changed, and so had the balance of power. The shutdown had proven that even without military force, a small neighbor could bring Russia's supply system to its knees. As winter approached, the trucks still waited, silent witnesses to a geopolitical transformation, playing out one checkpoint at a time. Winter arrived early that year, sweeping across the Kazakh steppe and southern Russia with icy winds that made survival harder for everyone. Caught in the crisis, the trucks that once stood at the border were now covered in frost, their engines frozen, their drivers gone home or relocated to other routes. What had started as a temporary disruption had turned into a full-blown logistics meltdown. Inside Russia, transportation companies were collapsing one after another. Without the Kazakhstan Land Bridge, the cost of moving goods had tripled. and entire supply chains had disintegrated. Supermarkets in regional towns were struggling to restock, and local officials quietly admitted that rationing had begun. Fuel prices skyrocketed, and small businesses that relied on imported parts were forced to close their doors. The government in Moscow kept insisting on television that everything was under control, that new trade corridors were being opened through China and Iran. But those routes were slow, expensive, and insufficient to replace what was lost. In many regions, people started calling it the silent blockade because no bombs had fallen. No shots were fired, yet the economic damage was devastating. Western analysts began to say this was the most severe logistical crisis Russia had faced since the early 1990s. American intelligence assessments circulated in Washington, suggesting that the shutdown was not only a geopolitical maneuver but also a signal, a demonstration that Moscow's grip on Central Asia had weakened beyond repair. At the same time, the crisis was reshaping the region. China took advantage of the vacuum, investing heavily in new rail lines through Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan that bypassed Russian territory entirely. Turkish companies began shipping goods across the Caspian Sea, linking Central Asia directly to the Middle East and Europe. These new routes, once experimental, were becoming permanent. The power map of Eurasia was changing, and Russia's role was shrinking. Western media covered the story closely, framing it as a turning point in global trade networks. Economists compared it to the fall of the Berlin Wall, not in terms of politics, but in the redirection of commerce and influence. Inside Russia, the human cost continued to grow. Truckers who had once made good livings now struggled to find work. Manufacturing plants shut down for lack of parts. Farmers complained that fertilizers and equipment from Central Asia were delayed for months. The ruble fell again, and inflation pushed the price of basic groceries out of reach for many families. People grew angry, not just at the government but at the sense of isolation closing in from all sides. For the first time, even loyal regional governors began to hint that Moscow's policies were unsustainable. They needed solutions, not slogans. Yet the Kremlin continued to portray the crisis as a temporary problem caused by foreign interference, refusing to admit how much power had truly slipped away. When spring finally came, the first signs of movement appeared at the border. Kazakhstan quietly reopened sections of the trade route, but it was too late to undo the damage. By then, the major logistics companies had gone bankrupt, and alternative trade corridors through China and Turkey were already operating at full capacity. Russian businesses found themselves cut out of deals they once dominated. The reopening was symbolic, a gesture of goodwill perhaps, but the old order was gone. In Astana, officials celebrated new trade agreements with Beijing and Ankara, marking the birth of a new Central Asian trade axis. For them, the crisis had accelerated a process that might have taken decades. Kazakhstan was now a hub for Eurasian commerce, no longer dependent on Moscow's approval. In Washington, analysts described the outcome as a strategic victory without a single soldier deployed. By leveraging geography, Kazakhstan had achieved what sanctions and diplomacy could not: a realignment of regional influence. In Moscow, the realization was bitter. The Kazakhstan Land Bridge collapse, as it came to be known in international media, had exposed a truth that many had ignored. Russia's network of influence was built on fragile foundations. The crisis had redrawn the trade map, shifting economic power south and east. The once dominant Eurasian Economic Union now existed mostly on paper, its members pursuing their own paths. Inside Russia, the government tried to frame the reopening as a diplomatic success. But few believed it. The shelves were still thinly stocked, prices still high, and trust in official promises nearly gone. Across Eurasia, a new landscape had emerged. Kazakhstan stood stronger, tied to multiple partners instead of one. China expanded its Belt and Road reach deeper into Central Asia. Turkey gained new leverage as a regional connector. And Russia, though still powerful, had learned that borders could be just as effective as battlefields in shifting global power. The land bridge had once symbolized unity and trade. Now it stood as a monument to change, a frozen line in the steppe, where one empire's control had quietly faded into history.